Hello, I'm Kevin Hong. I'm a partner at LYC Partners, an executive search and leadership advisory firm. I'm also the co-founder of The Council, a private network for senior executives. And this is Leaders in Motion.
Today, I'm joined by Yvan Gilliard. Yvan has spent 17 years building and rebuilding how large organizations actually run. The supply chains, the order flows, the payment infrastructure, the part of the business that either fall together or fall apart when a company tries to grow. He's worked across Belgium, the US, and now APAC, including a stint in Taipei, and has moved between retail, e-commerce, and logistics at companies like Radial, where he ran both the payments and the omnichannel operations business. In this conversation, we'll get into what it really takes to transform how a company operates, not on paper, but in practice. Why execution is where most change programs actually die, and what he's learned and what he's learned from across three very different business environments. Yvan, welcome to Leaders in Motion.
Thank you, Kevin. Great to be here.
Great. As we always do, that'd be great to have a short introduction of yourself, your journey. You moved between countries and you touch on different sectors.
Okay, yeah. So essentially, having gone through my education in business administration in Belgium, I jumped into kind of the classic first step of joining a consulting company at Deloitte. Ran through the first 5 years of my career in supply chain and strategy consulting, probably sampling most of the industries you can think from retail to chemicals to biotech companies in Belgium before joining a pure operations player and stepping outside of the consulting world. After a while, you want to switch on the business side. And so I joined the Cinemanex, which is a European distributor of cinema equipment, so the technology side of a movie theater, to lead their European operations. So that was ultimately the part of my career where I led 24/7, 365 operations, service, logistics, customer support in Europe before actually going through a headhunting process and joining a Lagardère group, which became later UBWay, which was a Belgian distributor of newspaper magazines, but also owned its own retail network of newsstand stores. That was a group that had the kind of a holding company that held 5 different companies, and the CEO then needed somebody to step in to have an operations mindset, but a consulting background. And that's where I hit into my hybrid profile, is like having both worlds and being able to step up and set up a corporate group level PMO organization, leveraging already a few drawers of the past experience for that distribution group in Belgium. And then after that, essentially our company was bought by the Belgian Post as an acquisition and then became part of a wider group in Belgium, who then acquired one of the biggest American e-commerce logistics companies. So that's where my international career started. And I had the opportunity to raise my hand and said I always dreamed of living and working, experiencing international corporate life, and then made the jump to Philadelphia in the US to join Radial. With a little bit of a flashback, in 1997 is the company under GSI Commerce who invented and started the very first e-commerce flows globally. Shipping sporting goods off a garage, right? The traditional e-commerce story, well, the very first of that happened in 97 in Pennsylvania. So I joined that company in 2019 and worked with them for about 7 years across multiple functions, but the common thread line being working for successive CEOs in running the most strategic topics, from onboarding new brands and clients. And when I say brands for an e-commerce fulfillment company, it's a Hugo Boss, it's a Tom Ford that joins an e-commerce and then provides their operations for us to manage as a third-party provider. And then along the 7 years, managing the strategic projects, managing transformation, up until the end, being responsible as SVP of payments and omnichannel, responsible for 2 of the divisions driving a lot of the revenue of the company. And then after that, I did join as a temporary executive engagement company in Australia, UmbrellaNet, active in cybersecurity and IT services. That's for my short elevator pitch on my career so far.
What do you think were the moments that really defined the most important transition that allowed you to be promoted, to be exposed to an opportunity to go to the US? So can you share with me what were some reasons, some situation, and what do you think these factors were?
For me, it's the leadership, the people, the mentors that I worked with, and the first call that I got when I was in my last years at Deloitte from the COO of my next company, who said, "Hey, we work together. I know you. I want you to come and take my job," because he was promoted to COO. And I was like, wow, unique opportunity, immediate trust, somebody who knows how you work and gives you that blanket trust, and you become head of logistics for Europe with that. And then the next step after that was the same, right? It was somebody, well, like you, Kevin, the headhunter, who's like, well, I'm interested in your experience. We have a conversation, and then introduced me to my next CEO, very smart guy who needed somebody as a sparring partner to lead the most strategic projects of his company. And then it's a conversation, right? But you realize you have somebody who absolutely trusts you as a sparring partner to discuss the strategic topics of the company. And then together with the executive team, manage those different steps. So for me, what has been defining is realizing once you have that bond and relationship with the most senior level of the company, then running your job is much more easy. And you have that confidence to start interacting, of course, with the whole of the company, making it happen. And then making it happen for me, not just with the C-suite level, the senior level and the lower levels, which is why for me, I tend to call myself kind of a hands-on executive, or for those who know the reference, like a corporate MacGyver executive. But often it's like that, right? You're operating at the highest level, but you're able to navigate most of the organization.
You mentioned that you had trust with the person who hired you. That's quite interesting because you didn't necessarily mention my resume, my achievements, the performance. How would you explain that trust? Is it more personal? Is it a chemistry? Is it values, personality, or also credentials and beyond?
I think the resume and the experience has importance. And I've hired a lot of directors and other people. So resume has its importance. But I would say once you spend a little bit of time, not too much time looking at the resume, you're like, okay, credibility is there. He's done his homework. He's led teams. He's delivered some work for some significant, credible organizations. The rest is character. It's okay, how does that person behave emotionally, interpersonally, right? Is that person going to start grilling me during the interview and asking me a tons of questions? Or is he a listener? How do I project him working with my team and myself? So I think for me, as a person who has hired and was hired, I think that has mattered a lot.
Is it something that you've been taught that you work on?
I'm a little bit born into it, being from a family who does that networking, and maybe having been, you might laugh, but having been the kid who often found more interesting staying between the adults than with the other kids because the conversations were interesting and you're meeting new interesting people. So I think that networking side, if you enjoy being that, I think that's probably the one thing that new joiners or younger people are like, yeah, how do you cultivate that? And I would say I'll give it out to Deloitte as my first employer, who tell you in one of your first weeks, look around you. These are the most important people for you right now. But in 10 years from now, look at your network. Don't underestimate it. And that people aspect is going to remain crucial.
Coming back to the operational level and the results that you achieved, can you share what were the most difficult challenges or high tower projects that you led and under high pressure, high exposure, high visibility?
I would probably say the most extreme. Imagine a Belgian guy arriving in the US, fresh there in Philadelphia, and then a few weeks later being told your team and you are responsible to open 3 new distribution centers, and you're going to end up having to operate and onboard 30 new brand clients, and you have 6 months. And what you have is a team of 4 project managers for North America. Just imagine that. And after the fact, knowing that there has been 75% turnover in those 6 months in the project management team. So just imagine having only one person of the team surviving. So yeah, that has been one of probably my most defining moments, being how do you react, and your conversations with CEO executive level being what do you need from us? Because you manage the most important income stream into the company, new clients coming in, and our capacity to take over that capacity being new distribution centers and capacity across North America. So for me, it was about at the same time getting to know the company and the operations, being my listener mode, and then on the other side, preparing and hiring additional manpower to be able to manage the additional workload. So it was a lot of human time. So I would say I spent half of my days on running interviews and the other half defining playbooks, meaning sucking the knowledge out of everybody in the company, saying like, how have we opened new distribution centers in the past? Because there was no playbook, right? How have we done that? Because we're going to have to do it 3 times in 6 months. Who can do that? How do we teach? How do we end up putting things down and building some structure and process? Because what I've often realized, there's no correlation between the size of the company and how much processes they have, or you assume that they have, or playbooks that you assume that they have. So, but you have a lot of people who've done it before. So you're often inches away from having that playbook. And so I've done a lot in my career on that, which has been a lot about listening and telling people like, hey, putting that down, I'm not replacing you, right? I'm using you as the preacher or the subject matter expert to put your knowledge down so that we can industrialize and build at scale. And that first experience of scaling, and I tend to love the word scaling because like a lot is required to do that. Scaling processes, scaling people, scaling leadership requires most of that.
It's interesting. You mentioned that you said something, I will not replace you. So do you have the feeling that somewhere people were a little bit defensive about answering your questions, and why?
Subject matter experts or people that have knowledge which they know is important to one of the steps in the process is human nature. They tend to be defensive and they tend to be like, why do you need to know that? I can do it for you. Yeah, you can do it for me, but I also want, like, at some point we need to go larger, scale up, being able to repeat the process more, right? So it takes a lot of work to convince sometimes people. And sometimes, I'm operations, I'm talking to the IT or technology guy, right? And in many circumstances, as a transformation person, you end up walking on sometimes a bit on eggs or walking on the toes of some colleagues, being like, I want to document all of it because we need together to scale. So it's about showing them the way and telling them, it's not about you losing your job or you being replaced because you're not doing good. You're the subject matter expert, and we want some other baby SMEs to come or project managers that need to be able to run it and then come to you.
Do you understand the fear of letting go of one's value for the organization? They hold somehow a lot of value and to the organization, and at some points, people don't need to go to them because the organization has built an infrastructure that will allow to run without that person.
I do understand it totally. We probably even see it more nowadays with AI, but in general, old school way, there is that risk, there is that human nature, and I think that's where, together with the line management, you need to talk through it. It's like, hey, this person has been here for 25 years. He's our most senior technology person, right? Each time there is a problem and I'm sitting in the office of the CTO, he opens his door and he shouts that person's name, and that person comes to the office and he fixes the problem, right? So those people have tremendous value. And I think going through that, you start realizing like, okay, but then what is their career path? And you realize a lot of organizations have not thought about career path for experts. Between the traditional track and the specialist track, the most undervalued track is that specialist SME track in companies, right? Oh, project manager, senior project manager, director of project management, that's the easy part, right? But in your highly competent technical people, that's sometimes a bit overlooked.
You mentioned also you were doing that in order to scale leadership. What do you mean? Maybe you can explain a little bit more. How do you scale leadership? How do you put processes into leadership?
I would say by involving sometimes the leadership more. You realize silos in companies happen, work gets done, but the more you work, I tend to use the word transversal, but across the board, you communicate. I'm a communicator. I tend to like informing people because I realize it makes my life so much easier. Transparency and communication makes the life of my life easier. There's no surprises, and then down the line, people cannot say they were not aware. And then scaling or boosting leadership is for me involving more leadership layers in in what we do to scale up. And sometimes is adding some leaders, right? And I'm mentioning that because I went from an organization that we were 4 project managers when I started. And 2 years later, we had taken over every project manager that was in the company. We had put that all together in a whole enterprise organization that was almost 60 project managers. Now imagine an organization that has 60 project managers, but all of them were across all the organization. But in the end, you realize, well, yeah, there were some IT project managers, some operations project managers, some business analysts doing the work, and everybody was doing things their own way, right? And in the end, you have a CEO in a company that says, we need to double our size in 5 years. How am I going to do that if all these 50 people work with their project tool, with their Excel, their Microsoft project things there? So there's a lot that need to be done at the same time. Tools, people, convincing leadership. But I mean, that's what we did in 2.5 years at Radial until I was leading that enterprise PMO function before moving on the business side.
How do you arbitrate between the things that need to be simplified, unified, and what is relevant to a function, market, product, client? How do you define, draw the line?
End of the day, you take a long list of everything you think you need to do, and you analyze impact, and you say like, hey, this is the goal of what we need to achieve. I've got all these levers that I'm able to pull. Some levers of simplification, some levers like hiring some people, and then what is going to deliver the right impact, knowing I cannot have everything that I want, right? I have not been in any company where I was getting everything that I want in terms of resources, budget, of everything. Right? So some of it is like, okay, we're going to do some simplification on a napkin in the corner of the table because that's the only way we're able to do it because we're not getting the budget. And on the other hand, okay, we'll prioritize getting some people. So I think to answer your question for me is really like, hey, these are the different angles that we can play. And I've been surprised often. Put the problem to your team. I find for me, one of the biggest lessons in leadership is humility. Like I'm only as smart as, okay, I have a lot of experience, but I'm only as smart as the team that I have. And when you take your team together and say, listen, here's our playground. Here's the budget issues that we have. Transparency, communication to your team. Team actually, it helps when you tell them a bit more. How can we solve this problem? I've had some great brainstorming and you've realized that some people have thought about things before. And you can have some cheaper or more pragmatic solutions that can help you in the meantime. So I believe a lot in that, in the power of the collective team. My own team, and sometimes you can put it to the leadership too. But I tend to believe that within your own remit, you can develop a lot of creativity and solutions.
How do you define that the impact has been relevant? And so in the end of the day, all the transformation that you pushed, what was the result afterwards? And were the management satisfied? And also how was the team seeing the transformation?
Well, first of all, that famous year with 30 new brands, 3 fulfillment centers, well, we made it. So, of course, the impact was like one of the record years after that was just prior to COVID. And so, of course, a record year, and you became the benchmark, right? So for me, the success was measured is like, well, we ended up in end of year peak, which in logistics e-commerce is like between Black Friday, Cyber Monday and Christmas, like everything is working. All those new clients are working with us. So great. A lot of things to adjust. So success is that. Success is being the US within a global group and then start hearing headquarters globally is like, oh my God, like how did you guys pull that off? Like, how have you been working? What tools have you been working? What are you guys doing in the US actually, right? And so actually it means that a year later, we were talking about building a competence center globally, but with input from us in America after what we did. And that's when you have talent. And I'm using the example without naming names, but I had a project manager who was in her mid-20s, who was starting becoming the reference for project management globally because of what we did that year. So for me, that's one measure of success. And of course, what we launched delivered a lot to the top line of the company that year.
You're very passionate about this scalability and the possibility of applying the results across the board. Do you feel like this is something that maybe can be talked a little bit later in terms of industry?
I'm going to say I'm professionally born in the consulting world. I then made my marks. It was movie theater distribution. Then it was newspaper retail business, and then e-commerce in the US, right? I think I tend to call myself sometimes a bit industry agnostic, but a lot of those principles in leadership, in managing teams, solving problems and scaling are applicable across the board. But then you need to be cognizant that each industry has got specifics, regulations, special processes that you need to use, and then you need to fine tune. But I call that like more of an industry fine tuning in general. But if you think about senior leadership level, a lot of it is applicable across the board for me in how you deliver transformation, in how you deliver change, or in how you lead and grow teams ultimately. And I think the way I've learned to grow teams, because I've had to learn it in my very first jobs, and how I've done it in my lately. Take the example, my side story, but my grandpa was a pharmacist, old school pharmacist. And old school pharmacies, like imagine wooden wall with a lot of drawers and jars and potions. I find myself after 17 years career as like being a pharmacist, but every jar and every wooden drawer is a bit of experience, is an interaction that I had in my movie theater year, or interaction we had the CEO, and that now I'm pulling of all those experiences.
Among all the inventory of experiences, do you have any that you feel more passionate about, a specific industry sector?
I mean, I had a lot of fun in e-commerce. I think one that is in my early career that I enjoyed was when I was responsible for the integration. So chain of supermarkets in Belgium acquired another network of supermarkets, and I was the one single person managing the post-merger integration of that chain into another. And it was a family-owned supermarket chain, very rare nowadays, right? And you're responsible that a few months later, day one, branding, imagine supermarkets, everything happens in the same way. So for me, it's one of the experiences I look back the most fondly in my early career. Lately, I would say my payment side. I'll be blunt. When the CEO of Radial in the US told me, Ivan, I would like you to take over our payments division, I told him, I know nothing about payments. I mean, I know online payments, Apple Pay, Google Pay, and stuff like that, but I know nothing about payments and fraud prevention. He said, well, exactly, because you're the person who's going to be asking why, the 5 whys, why do you do something like that? Convince me. And I said, of course, you want me to ask? That'd be great. And so I ended up running payments and fraud for North America. Well, actually globally, because we had global clients. And for me, that was amazing because I had a team of true experts, people that work in payments and fraud globally for the past 20 years. And my first message to them was like, I'm never going to be as good at payments as you guys, but I will ask you a lot of questions and we will rebuild our brand. And what we did was rebuilding our payments solutions brand on the market in the US for the first 2 years. So that for me was the latest, most fun experience, because we had a team who was not disregarded, but was felt a bit demotivated because they didn't see leadership that was interested or believed in them. And that's because you need to spend time with the experts, show them that you believe that they are the experts, and then work together and say, well, we have this business, we believe in this business. Hey, okay, we'll go to conventions together, right? Because I need to learn, and you're going to introduce me to other guys that you know, because that's how I will be a great payments and fraud leader. So for me, that's probably the best experience that I had, was rebuilding a payments and fraud team.
Can you tell me more about how Radial was positioned at the time and whether you managed to brought different results?
So given the fact that Radial was, 97, the company that started e-commerce flows, they had to do their payments. So they actually started extremely early to run the fraud and the payments, or facilitate payments for their first clients. So they did that from 97 until now, which is more than 20 years. I think payments, what you see now, I mean, the added value was combining, right? You have a brand that gives you their e-commerce, their flows, you do their payments, and you combine. So it's the price effect of saying, well, if you give me your logistics operations, I'm going to run your payments. I know if there is fraud, all of it together provides a cohesive bundle that you provide better service and you can provide a better pricing. So I think that was our core value proposition. And also because, compared to other service providers, payments and especially fraud, the more history you have in that business, the better you are at it. We are in the age of AI and machine learning, but it still means that if you're able to configure rules the right way with 15, 20 years of history of fraud and patterns, you can do a much better job than somebody who starts a fraud business tomorrow. So I think I realized that we were not using that asset. And so it's like, okay, actually, you know what? Our best tagline is, we've been in payments for that long. We have better detection rates than anybody else. Sometimes it's go back to the basics. What is it that we do? And then you realize you have a legal department and you need to sit down with everybody. We cannot say that. We cannot do marketing with that. Okay, what can we say? So going back to the basics of like, hey, here's what we do. What do we do better? What can we say out there? And so the first LinkedIn post I did on payments were really like, here's what we do. The 1% figure we do better than anybody else. Hope that answers right. Yeah.
That's interesting. And how do you see that across border? Do you see that this translates across markets, and how does it translate across markets?
I think payments is very fragmented. Each market. Especially if you talk APAC, right? But if you talk, America and Europe is much more simple. Like it's rather unified in processes, very easy to handle as a brand. APAC is more fragmented because there's payment systems and rules and regulations by country. So I think for me, that's the biggest takeaway is I think there's a lot more work and potentially value to add if you're able to operate globally for running e-commerce, payments, and fraud in general. But what I've seen in my period there is I see that there are some big players, but there's still not one size fits all. So if I am a global brand, I'm the biggest cosmetic brands in the world, the biggest luxury brand in the world. Yeah, you need serious partners who are able to cover globally. But in the end, look at your experience as an individual. Every website is local. Every website, e-commerce shop tends to be local, which means the payments tend to be tied to some local markets. So that's the interesting part about e-commerce, right? And that's where I think I'm curious to see how, if it ever moves more globally. Even Amazon, right? Amazon has more regional, but I think that's one of the few players that is operating at an industrial scale with some more regional hubs, but then they ship international.
What do you think? Do you think that some global players are seeing APAC?
I'll take the example, Coupang, that Korean e-commerce brand that is coming to Taiwan here and growing. So I think there's good trends, and I think it probably requires, new business models, right? Because often when people tend to say it's complex, I'm going to come back with my 5 whys. Like, why is it complex? What is causing the issue? And then sometimes you realize the hurdle might not be that high to jump, but it's about like, okay, are we going straight with a new model or trying to change an existing business? Which is why I tend to say disruptors sometimes are very annoying because they just started now. They jump and they have something that works maybe across a few markets. So I think for e-commerce in Asia, I'm curious to see how some new players can build a new standards. It's a little bit the same as take the example of Grab or some of those super apps, right? Grab or the Ubers alike or the Food Pandas that are able to work across different markets more easily than other historical businesses, I would say.
It's not as easy to scale as fast in Asia, but what do you think?
It's definitely not as easy because the US is a country the size of a continent almost, but I would say choose wisely your first market, right? And make it a success. So that's why I would say like choose a first Asian, don't just go for APAC like you would go for the US. How do you devour a whale? It's one bite at a time. You don't devour a whale in one chunk. So I would say just choose wisely what is a first Asian market where the response might be the right one. Because people have the right habits. Now, the US is easy because everybody's buying habits in America have been influenced by Amazon. So Amazon has educated the whole of America about how to buy an online. So launching something online nowadays is very easy in the US. What are the markets in Asia where you would say there is a great habit that I can use for my business? And that's where I want to launch first and create my success story. And I guess that's probably what Coupang did in Korea. And then there's choosing some next target markets like Taiwan. Probably if you take Korea, Japan, Taiwan are more like technologically similar and can work well for some businesses.
What do you think about Taiwan? the positioning, the economy, the potential, and why did you choose to be in Taiwan?
All right, I'll start with the last one. So why did I choose to be in Taiwan? Where I was working for an Australian company who had expansion plans into Asia, and I was still based in California. So first of all, time zone wise, operating remotely from Taiwan was much more convenient to collaborate in APAC with Australia and work on potential expansion plans in Asia. I chose Taiwan because it was a very, very welcoming to foreigners and foreign workers as an executive here, and it was very it was an easy jump for me. The second best jump was Thailand, but on the way I realized there is personally a great comfort of living here to establish myself, and it made it very easy, very fast. So that's why I chose Taiwan. To answer the rest of your question, well, now after 6 months, definitely have the feeling that what people say in terms of a hidden gem, right? Taiwan, you need to scratch the surface and live there to realize how it operates. It may look a little bit traditional or old school in some aspects, but then once you scratch that surface, you start getting interested. You realize you might be a lot more operating like Japan, like modern economies than you think, right? With some old school touches, but definitely a lot of potential. And you realize you have a very affordable cost of life here for professionals if you need to build teams or companies operating. So definitely, I have a feeling after 6 months that Taiwan is definitely has a lot more potential than what companies give it. And I know there is a bit of a political side to why companies are afraid to come on this way, but I would tend to say there's a lot more potential than what it is being used for.
Do you think that the political aspect is more negative for Taiwan than positive? I would have assumed that Taiwan being more in the middle between the East and the West, that it would have been a more safe place to be as an American company, as a European company. But I'm curious to hear.
I agree with you. It should be. It should be. I would say the political environment probably plays against it because of, we call it in French, l'épée de Damoclès, the sword potentially hanging on Taiwan for the reasons that we know. But if you make abstraction of that and say, okay, that it's for other reasons, it might not happen, Taiwan has the perfect location. Taiwan, to me, sometimes as a Belgian, feels like Belgium being in the center of Europe, right in the middle, geographically perfectly located to play a big role. I feel Taiwan has a bit of that same potential. It's geographically perfectly located in the middle of Asia. It has highly educated people, and it is not as expensive to operate in as a country compared to especially to other East Asian countries. Southeast Asia, I think, is a different story.
What makes you, in your opinion, a little bit better when it comes to navigating multicultural environments today?
I guess I grew up in a country that is multicultural in Belgium. I've had the luck of having parents that took us and exposed us to a lot of cultures, but then I've been traveling for the past 15 years. As I was making my own living, I could choose my destination, so I keep traveling abroad. And for me, exposing myself to cultures and traveling has opened my mind a lot and has opened the way I behave and I interact with people a lot. And I find that international curiosity helps a lot. It helps a lot at work. It helps personally, but it helps a lot at work because you work with people from different cultures. I think that is an important factor. And then I come back to the humility side of things, right? You never know what happens in people's lives until you pay interest to it. And then you might not always know the true story of people, but then do not assume, right? It's not because one of your team members comes every day on time at 8 a.m. that they had a perfect day at home. One of my most defining moments I had as a leader on training was when I was sent for leadership training in Eastern Romania. Basically, we were told you need to learn humble leadership. And so we were sent to Eastern Romania, actually to the border with Ukraine, in a city that had slums. And we were taught, you're going to go teach kids in the slums. So we were working with a mobile school, blackboards, and then teaching kids mathematics and stuff like that, but in a very easy way, right? So you do that with the kids, and then you start realizing, but what are the parents doing? Well, the parents, they all work in the luxury hotels where you guys are staying. So we're staying in a nice hotel in town while we're doing the leadership things. And then we start realizing that the parents of those kids are actually the staff working in the hotel, but you had no idea. that those people go back to those circumstances. So I would say traveling, being exposed to cultures, but also keeping that openness and like humility for me has probably helped me a lot.
You might have experience also training juniors and a newer generation. And like over the last 17 years, have you seen a shift in terms of skill sets or characters or leadership traits that appear more, maybe less today than you used to see 15 years ago?
Definitely a shift. And it's funny because when I meet back friends, we don't work together, but then we observe the same things. Definitely a shift that you realize younger generations, or at least corporates, are definitely much more impatient in getting promoted, or the expectation is like, hey, I just did something great. When am I getting my reward? I guess sometimes I feel like I'm still a young professional, but I guess I'm getting old, and I realize like, okay, you do what you're supposed to do, you do it well, and then potentially your reward comes, a promotion and things like that. You don't need to ask for it. And I realized one first finding is younger generation is much more like, okay, this was done. Like, what am I getting? As like, there's a lot more assertiveness and expectation of reward. And so the cycle of promotion and those rewards is expected to be much faster. That's definitely one thing. The second is a lot more, I don't like the term, but a lot more discussions on work-life balance and on like, what does it take for you to put in to work to get that extra mile and getting called an overachiever. I think in the younger generation, there's a lot more about, hey, I've done my job. I've done what's on my job description. So when am I getting like, well, you end up in those conversations where you say like, well, you've done what's expected. So, meet expectations versus exceeding expectations. We've all been there professionally. So a lot more debates around that with the younger generation, I think, where I was, of course, a consultant, so I know what it is to work some evenings and late and that's successively to end up like doing that extra mile. That's, I think, probably the two main differences, I would say.
We cannot close the conversation without talking about young generation and consultant, the future of consulting as well. With AI, there's a lot of discussion around, first of all, consulting is becoming less and less relevant. I'd like to understand your take on that.
So even though professionally being in project management and transformation inside companies, often my job is like, well, how can we do ourselves without using some consultants? I'm a strong believer in the consulting track. I'd say if I had to do it again, I would do it 2 times over again. So I would say as a freshman out of college, I think it's still an amazing first step as a career. I'm sure the role might evolve, especially, we call them business analysts. I get the work on business analysts and crunching data and reporting. I'm sure with AI, it's changing drastically. Maybe less late nights for the consultants in producing reports, but I think it's a great first step in terms of the qualities. I think it's still the same as being able to dive into a business and be curious. For me, it's always been about that, right? Initially, I didn't know what I wanted to do out of college. People were asking, "What do you want to do?" I had no idea. And then a friend told me, "You should go work for Deloitte." I said, "No, they're accounting firms." I said, "I don't want to be accounting." He said, "No, they do consulting. Just go talk to the guys." And I talked to a supply chain director of Deloitte who told me like, "No, we do some work like in factory improvement." And I said like, "Well, what I want to do is I just want to walk on a factory floor and see things to improve and tell them what to improve." That was my student belief. And he told me, "Well, might not be your first project, but that is what we do, right? We go, we dig in, and we invest time." So I think for me, that's still the number one added value of the consulting, is having somebody external come in, spend time, tell you a little bit of what you know, but also tell you a few things that you didn't know and how you benchmark against the outside world. And so you need talent and young students who are able to step into that with, I'm assuming now, some AI training that they will get at school and university.
Given what you mentioned about newer generation being more transactional to the work, like I've done something and I expect something in return, and also the fact that you have AI competing like for some like business analyst task, maybe not the role entirely, but task at least. What would be the advice that you would give to someone who is today aspiring for the consulting track?
My number one advice is sometimes is patience. Is like, is trusting the process. They say like, you're going to learn things that you've never known before going through that. You're going to get exposure to industries in a short amount of time, like nowhere else. Like when you're able to go into medical, into retail, into chemicals and all of that, you manage to do that within 6 months. The amount of exposure and knowledge you know through that consulting track is like nowhere else. Does it mean you love every project you do? No. I've had projects as consultants that I personally hated, right? I really didn't like it. But looking back at it, I learned things. I learned that, okay, this type of work, I'm not made for it. But luckily, 2 months later, I'm on another project. So I think it's knowing what you get out of that type of track and being like, well, yeah, it's might not be the end of the world. You're going to learn so much more about your professional preferences and what you like to do.
Thank you, Yvan. I would close this conversation with this great inspiring advice for the newer generation of leaders. And again, thank you for was inspiring.
Thank you, Kevin. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Leaders in Motion. And if you want to go further, join the Leaders in Motion Academy, our executive program. The first step is simple. Subscribe to our newsletter in the show notes, and you'll get access to our exclusive insights and all the details about the Academy. This podcast is produced by Melanie Hong, who helps leaders and organizations create strategic podcasts. I'm Kevin Hong, and see you next time.